Do as I say, not as I do. Every parent knows this mantra, exhorting our children to attend more to our hopefully wise teaching, not our abysmal practice. In politics, though, there is often the need for the opposite maxim. Do as I do, not as I say. It is to the deeds of the great statesman, shrewdly weighing the winds that buffet the ship of state, not the syllogisms of political philosophers, that we should look above all in framing our political practice. And the wisest political writers are those who call our attention to the world more than to their own words. Too often we ignore them, endowing their own tentative solutions with an aura of infallibility, and excusing ourselves from the hard work of asking how they might act and reason in our own day. Philosophical history is full of the phenomenon of fact-finders followed by ideologues, trailblazing thinkers, their eyes open to the world around them, and behind them, a train of unimaginative zealots, their eyes fixed on the great man's footprints. So it is with conservatism today. Conservatives today are likely to be ideologues at least as much as their left-wing counterparts. The only difference is they aren't even interesting ideologues. Anyone who has spent their time in the world of conservative think tanks and conservative conferences, at least until the past few years, could be pretty sure that they'd heard it all before. The economics panels would be full of stale, recycled mantras of Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek, with little of any effort to show how these mantras actually illuminate the world of 2021, the rise of China, the collapse of American manufacturing, the resurgence of nationalism. The law and politics panels will be obsessed with the question, what would the founders say? Nearly every argument would be resolved by an appeal to authority. For the ideologue, it may be sufficient to know that an opinion is authorized, but some at least may ask, but is it true? Of course, there's a place for an appeal to authority, and as a historian, I'm all about quoting half-remembered authorities. In fact, I'll be doing a lot of that in this talk. But anyone can appeal to some authority. Why should we listen to these authorities rather than those? The only correct answer must be because they illuminate the real world. They are authorities not because of the answers they give us, but because of the path they show us, a diligent, humble, fine-grained attention to what is happening around us. The genius of conservatism, I would thus argue, is its empiricism, its willingness to learn from experience and reject mere theoretical reasoning that often issues in utopian flights from reality or artificially tidy systems. In the 1790 edition of his Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith diagnosed a perennial temptation of politics, the lure of system. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard, forgetting that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. How horrified he would have been to discover, a quarter of a millennium later, legions of small-minded followers using his name like an incantation for economic theories that would reduce man to the status of a wealth-maximizing automaton. 2 years earlier, one of America's most illustrious pioneers of political economy and national power, as David has already talked about, Alexander Hamilton, defended the U.S. Constitution in the New York Ratifying Convention against its ideologically purist opponents by saying, "I am therefore disposed not to dwell too long on curious speculations or pay much attention to modes and forms, but to adopt a system whose principles have been sanctioned by experience, adapt it to the real state of our country, and depend on probable reasonings for its operation and result." In other words, the best constitution was the one that worked, not the one that conformed best to a preconceived ideal. Hamilton would not have been impressed with modern-day Federalists more interested in curious speculations about the ideal constitution as it existed in the minds of the founders than in the lessons of 2 centuries of experience in constitutional government. Now, does this mean that conservatives should cut loose from history and chart a course of pure pragmatism in response to the demands of the moment? Not at all. The Anglo-American conservative tradition has always been saturated in history. But it's important to rightly understand the function of history. We appeal to history not in dumb reverence or in escapist nostalgia, but as the best teacher of practical politics. David Hume put it well. Quote, "History furnishes us with materials from which we may form our observations and become acquainted with the regular springs of human action and behavior. These records of wars, intrigues, factions, and revolutions are so many collections of experiments by which the politician or moral philosopher fixes the principles of his science. From this, the politician learns both that human nature itself is stubborn, selfish, and unyielding, but also that the conditions of human society are almost infinitely variable. Both points are equally significant for the conservative mind. On the one hand, if human nature itself is plastic, then the visionary reformer can imagine a world in which his theories can transcend all past experience, as the transgender revolutionaries of today would do. But if not only human nature, but human society is fixed, then one set of observations should suffice to generate political principles that are good for all time. All we would have to do is discover the ideal constitution, the ideal economic regime, and we will be set. On the contrary, the only reliable way to frame good law, argued Smith, Hume, and their numerous disciples among the American founders, such as Hamilton and Madison, was to rely on the probable conclusions drawn from experience, not the false certainty of theoretical ideals, and to stand ready always to revise our conclusions in light of new experience. Too often, though, we take the results of someone's empiricism from yesterday and turn it into received dogmas. We venerate their answers while rejecting their method. Thus it is that conservatives today can venerate the constitutionalism of the founders without ever pausing to ask what relation it bears to the world of 2021, and can religiously quote Smith in economics while utterly refusing to engage in the detailed empirical research that guided his reflections. So let's look at these two case studies, constitutionalism and economics. The American Constitution itself is a testament to the genius of conservative empiricism. It is a masterpiece of practical politics. We must continue to honor it without allowing it to be transformed into a shibboleth of dogmatism. Too often on the right, the Constitution has been treated almost as a Platonic form, a geometric masterpiece balancing unity and plurality, in light of which the messy mixtures of practical politics will always be found wanting. Consider the famous doctrine of the separation of powers, often confused with the idea of checks and balances, as if overreaching power could always be prevented simply by balancing each neatly separated power, executive, legislative, judicial, against one another. But in fact, this was not the vision of the founders, but of their anti-federalist opponents, the original American political ideologues. The Federalists appealed less to theory than to experience, specifically the experience of the British Constitution. The great theorist of this Constitution, William Blackstone, had observed that, quote, "It is highly necessary for preserving the balance of the Constitution that the executive power should be a branch, though not the whole, of the legislative, a principle that the Federalists followed in their successful advocacy of the presidential veto. To find the correct balance of separation and mixture, Blackstone looked to the actual historical experience of English politics and the elaborate mechanisms it had developed for enabling the different branches of government to pursue common action without consolidating into one despotic power." In Federalist numbers 47 and 48, Madison pointed to this pragmatic mixture of powers sanctioned by successful British and colonial experience as the best way to ensure a functional regime. 45 years later, in his magisterial commentaries on the Constitution, Justice Joseph Story identified this hard-headed empiricism as the genius of the American constitutional tradition, noting that, quote, "A perfect separation is occasionally found supported by the opinions of ingenious minds dazzled by theory and extravagantly attached to the notion of simplicity in government." He tells his readers that, quote, "Those illustrious statesmen who formed the Constitution knew better. Constitutions of government he said, are not instruments to be scrutinized and weighed upon metaphysical niceties. Common sense becomes the guide and prevents men from dealing with mere logical abstractions. Thus, throughout his work, he invites his readers continually to reject platitudes and give careful consideration to the concrete operations of executive, legislative, and judicial power in order to discover the proper equilibrium of liberty and authority in practice. While constantly praising the insight of the founders into the science of government, he insists that we test their own conclusions as they themselves would have insisted against experience. Quote, the true and only test must, after all, be experience, which corrects at once the errors of theory and fortifies and illustrates the eternal judgments of nature. Too many conservatives today have become little more than Constitution museum curators, scurrying out in alarm whenever anyone on the right dares to suggest a bold policy innovation and nervously scolding, don't touch that, it's fragile. But as Theodore Roosevelt bellowed in exasperation when House Republicans spluttered about private property during his era's assault on big tech, he said, the Constitution was made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. Reverence for the Constitution today functions less as traditional conservative respect for the rule of law and more as a retreat from reality, a reality in which the conditions of society have evolved immensely since the age of the founders. The Constitution, though, at least has a fair claim to such genuflection. It is our fundamental law, after all. Not so the so-called laws of economics, which have been abused by conservatives in recent decades as an escape route from the hard work of practical politics. Nowhere has conservative thinking been more enslaved to ideology in recent decades than in this field. But it did not used to be this way. Conservative leaders used to be vigorous pragmatists in political economy, recognizing that the purpose of an economy was to serve the interests of the nation, and these interests were liable to change with time and with technology. In this, too, the founders and the great Scottish empiricists spoke with one voice. Although he is most often quoted today for what purport to be pithy summations of timeless economic truth, Adam Smith was in fact a rigorous empiricist. The wealth of nations was the product of 20 years of careful empirical observation and historical study, and very few of its conclusions are set down in the form of the unchanging and abstract economic laws so beloved of contemporary economists. Nor would Smith have endorsed the idealistic schemes of the future men of system, seeking to force complex societies into the Procrustean bed of simplistic free market schemes. Smith never believed that government inaction would magically produce a free and flourishing society, but called for a constant vigilance on the part of wise statesmen to ensure that competition remained equitable. Nor would markets broaden themselves. Smith argued that statesmen must actively promote the prosperity of the state by major public investments in roads, canals, and other transportation and communication networks. Even in the area of free trade, the policy reform most closely associated with him, Smith was a pragmatist and a gradualist who put national interest uppermost in any consideration of trade policy. Quote, as defense is of much more importance than opulence, he said, the act of navigation is perhaps the wisest of all the commercial regulations of England. To be sure, Smith did think that the preponderance of trade regulations served the interests of private monopolists rather than the public interest. And he did advocate a broad rollback of tariffs and restrictions. However, true to his pragmatic empiricism, Smith recognized the need to make haste slowly, balancing the benefits of free trade against the interests of workers. Quote, humanity may in this case require that the freedom of trade should be restored only by slow gradations and with a good deal of reserve and circumspection. Were those high duties and prohibitions taken away all at once, cheaper foreign goods of the same kind might be poured so fast into the home market as to deprive all at once many thousands of our people of their ordinary employment and means of subsistence. Smith, it seems, would never have endorsed the idiotic actions of free trade ideologues in the 1990s and 2000s, who gleefully flooded the American market with cheap East Asian goods and destroyed American manufacturing, with consequences that are visible today in empty shelves across the country and the endless lines of container ships waiting off of Long Beach, California. The statesmen of early America, though, especially in the Federalist Party, imbibed not only the conclusions of Smith's pioneering work, but more importantly, his empirical method. Unwilling to simply take his word for it, they carefully studied America's economic and political situation and adapted Smith's insights in light of their own observations. The masterpiece of early American political economy, Alexander Hamilton's 1791 Report on Manufactures, is a tour de force of such economic pragmatism. Hamilton granted the essential cogency of Smith's free trade theory, but elaborated on the exceptions in light of the American situation. For one thing, he argued, while there were obvious theoretical benefits in a global free trade system, that was not the world that America found itself in. And for America to attempt to compete with blatantly protectionist England while rejecting protection herself would be suicide. Hamilton, unlike the imbecile economists of the 1990s, understood that if a laissez-faire nation adopts free trade with another nation that is energetically subsidizing its industrial sector, the mercantilist nation will eat the laissez-faire nation's lunch every time. Perhaps a mature American economy, would effectively compete with the British behemoth, as American industry would do in the later 1800s. But maturity took time. Thus, Hamilton outlined a plan of infant industry protection for getting American manufacturing off the ground before subjecting it to withering competition. And even mature economies demanded some protection for the sake of national security. Hamilton wrote, "Not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures. Every nation, with a view to those great objects, ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. The possession of these is necessary to the perfection of the body politic, to the safety as well as the welfare of the society. The want of either is the want of an important organ of political life and motion. And in the various crises which await a state, it must feel severely the effects of such a deficiency." We've seen this in the past year. COVID-19 has embarrassingly exposed our nation's slavish dependence on foreigners for nearly all our essentials of national supply. Thank God at least that we haven't yet outsourced our pharmaceutical industry and been reduced to begging Russia and China for vaccines on a global exchange. In 1894, the great Republican statesman Henry Cabot Lodge mocked the blinkered and benighted dogmatism of the free trade theorists in a masterful speech, The Let Alone Theory. It is very interesting to know that there are men who really think that the complex affairs of humanity can be disposed of by a collection of epigrammatic half-truths and watch-pocket memoranda, and who firmly believe that they can regulate the vast mechanism of modern society with a latchkey, because that simple instrument suffices to open their own front doors. They are interesting also, for in another way, to use the expressive slang of the day, they know it all. The curious thing is that they really do know it all, if by it you mean free trade. It is possible for anyone to know everything about free trade, because its doctrines reached maturity 50 years ago and have stood still ever since, untaught by history and unchanged by facts. Not much has changed in the 120 years since. If national conservatism today is to have a future, it must expel from its ranks the legions of right-wing soothsayers who continue to believe that the complex affairs of humanity can be disposed of by a collection of epigrammatic half-truths and watch-pocket memorandum. The lesson of the American founders and the task of conservatives today is clear. Honor the past, yes, but also learn from the present if you want to have any future. Thank you.